Now it is time to welcome our high-level representatives. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to introduce our high-level representatives. From Japan, the host of the regional consultation, His Excellency Mr. Fumio Kishida, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. From Indonesia, His Excellency Mr. Hassan Klaib, the Deputy Minister of Multilateral Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And from OCHA, Her Excellency Ms. Valerie Amos, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Your Excellency, Mr. Kishida, it is my honor to invite you to address the regional consultation.
まずエイモス人道問題担当国連事務次長、そしてハッサンインドネシア外務省多国間総局長、そしてご列席の皆様方。
Madam Amos, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Your Excellency Mr. Hassan, Deputy Minister for Multilateral Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen.
今年は日本にとりまして ODA60 周年という節目の年にあたります。この記念の年に世界人道サミット地域準備会合を東京で開催できますこと、我が国は大変光栄に思っております。
This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Japanese ODA. It is our great honor to co-host the North and Southeast Asia Regional Consultation for the World Humanitarian Summit in Tokyo at this memorial year.
日本は人間の安全保障のこの理念のもと、人道支援に積極的に取り組んでまいりました。例えば昨年フィリピンにおいて発生した台風、このハイアンの被害に際しまして、過去最大規模の国際緊急援助隊を速やかに派遣したほか、緊急援助物資の供与や、この国際機関、NGO を通じた支援を実施いたしました。そして現在は復興フェーズの支援を行っております。
Japan has played an active role in humanitarian assistance under the guiding principle of human security. For example, when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines last year, Japan dispatched its largest ever disaster relief team and provided emergency relief goods, as well as assistance through international organizations and NGOs. Currently, Japan provides assistance for the reconstruction phase.
また、この日本は、この東日本大震災から多くのことを学びました。避難所にこの授乳や着替えをするための場所がなく、女性のこの避難生活に支障をきたす、こうしたことがありました。また、高齢者だけの世帯、あるいは母子、父子家庭、障害者の方など、異なる多様なニーズへ対応が課題となりました。
Japan learned many lessons from the Great East Japan earthquake, one of which was that women often face difficulties while living in shelters, such as the lack of space for breastfeeding or changing of clothes. In addition, meeting the different needs of people, such as the elderly or single-headed households or persons with disabilities, was indeed a challenge.
このような経験を踏まえ、日本はこの災害に強い社会づくりと この女性の参画の確保を重視しており、諸外国への支援においても配慮に努めております。来年3月、仙台市におきまして開催される第3回国連防災世界会議や世界人道サミットを含む各種プロセスにジェンダーの視線を盛り込むとともに、防災の主流化に取り組みます。
Based on these experiences, Japan places special focus on building a disaster-resilient society and promoting women's participation. Japan also takes these into consideration when we provide assistance overseas. We will promote the inclusion of gender perspectives as well as mainstreaming disaster risk reduction through various processes, including the Third UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction to be held in Sendai next March, as well as the World Humanitarian Summit.
アジアでは、この災害対応を含む地域協力の枠組みが重層的に発展してきております。日本は各国の防災関係者への研修、AHAセンターへのこの支援、コミュニティの防災能力強化のための技術協力などを進めております。
In Asia, multi-layered networks for regional cooperation have been advanced. Japan has extended such assistance as training for disaster management agencies, the AHA Center, and technical cooperation for strengthening communities' capacity for disaster risk reduction.
2016年にトルコで開催されます世界人道サミットの成功に向けて、この地域から有意義なインプットができますよう、皆様のさまざまな立場、あるいは視点に立った活発な議論が交わされることを心から期待をしております。
I hope that active discussions will be held based on different grounds and viewpoints so as to provide valuable inputs from this region, which will lead to the successful World Humanitarian Summit, which will be held in Turkey in 2016.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Kishida. Here I must inform you that the Minister Kishida has to leave for an urgent assignment, so please excuse himself. So next, Your Excellency, Deputy Minister Clive, it is now my honor to invite you to address the regional consultation.
Excellencies, indeed, the Minister has left, understandable. So I would like also to address through the Japanese colleagues my best regard and thanking Mr. Fumio Kishida, Minister for Affairs of Japan, Excellency Ms. Valerie Amos, USG and Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, distinguished participants. Let me begin by expressing Indonesia's deep appreciation to the government of Japan for taking this initiative of for hosting this regional consultation. And Indonesia, indeed, very pleased to co-chair on this such important deliberation. And I wish also to commend UN OCHA for facilitating in its role by itself. Japan, as a venue for this consultation, has a lot to offer, to add value to our deliberations in light of its long traditions and advanced practices in dealing with natural disaster. This meeting is held at the background that humanitarian challenges are increasingly more complex in terms of their nature and scope. The proliferations of frameworks at the regional and global level has also added to its complexity. Our region, indeed, cannot afford to remain idle. We are left with no other choice other than making real and concrete efforts in adjusting our regional and global approach. In light of this meeting, this consultation serves as a stepping stone to formulate our regional contribution to the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul 2016. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the Secretary General's 4 proposed themes are the basis of our discussion. They are humanitarian effectiveness, reducing vulnerability, transformation through innovation, and serving the needs of people in conflict. Allow me to highlight briefly our views on the 4 themes. On humanitarian effectiveness, we believe that accountability of humanitarian works is central to enhancing humanitarian effectiveness. Accountability means full compliance of humanitarian principles and good governance, especially in funding and disbursement management. Accountability brings legitimacy and support. Indonesia has thus developed standards of humanitarian accountability in the aftermath of tsunami that hit hard Aceh in 2004. Our region can set a good example to other regions by initiating and developing a regional guideline on humanitarian accountability. It can serve, in our view, at least 3 objectives. First, it will create greater transparency of the don'ts and the do's, respecting the principles of national ownership and ensuring the complementarities of international support and assistance to national effort are important ingredients to enhancing humanitarian effectiveness. Second, it will also increase trust among key regional and national stakeholders. And third, it will equally increase coherence and coordination among stakeholders. On reducing vulnerability and managing risk, in our view, resilience starts by empowering those living with risks and vulnerabilities. They are the first line of defense against the adverse effect of natural disaster. Investing in them is a strategic decision that will have lasting impacts. Indeed, it takes years in the making, but it is worth all of our efforts. Identifying potential pathways that would link and strengthen coordination between humanitarian affairs and sustainable development is a possible option to consider. Our region should consider shifting the traditional paradigm of humanitarian responsive to preventive. On transformation through innovation, technology-related innovation can spur a broader spectrum of innovation. Innovative ways of thinking, doing business, and mobilizing resources are some of the examples. Local wisdom and traditional knowledge can contribute in developing innovative ways relevant to humanitarian works. Establishing a regional network among research centers, academia, and experts can be the start of developing a compendium of innovation. This regional workshop can also facilitate transfer of knowledge. I should say this regional network can also facilitate transfer of knowledge and technology as part of bilateral, regional, and international cooperation for capacity building. And fourth, on serving the needs of people in conflict, we are of the view that our respective experience could provide lessons learned as a basis to develop a proper response to the needs of the victim of conflict in different situations. Focusing on the humanitarian context can enable us to formulate a sound and implementable recommendation. This will require beyond than observing to the principle of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. It will require the capacity to listen from people who are in conflict areas about their needs and their interests. Excellencies, distinguished participants, our regional consultation here involved a broad range of stakeholders since the beginning of the preparatory process leading to this meeting. With this in mind, there is no doubt that we can make significant contribution. Our meeting thus can and must provide valuable contribution by shaping a new global humanitarian architecture with a more holistic and coherent approach. Our meeting here can and must contribute in building block in the context of implementing the Secretary General's 5-year plan towards a more global, accountable, and robust humanitarian system. The nature and skills of future global humanitarian challenges that come from us may defy conventional responses. We need to reinforce a spirit of pioneerism, determination to challenge old assumptions. We need to push boundaries and break into new frontiers. With those key messages, I wish you a constructive and fruitful deliberations of this 2 days consultation, and I thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Deputy Minister Claib. And now, Your Excellency, Undersecretary General Amos, I would like to invite you to address the regional consultations.
Your Excellency, Mr. Hassan Kleeb, the Deputy Minister for Multilateral Affairs of Indonesia, Your Excellency, Ms. Alicia de la Rosa Bala, the Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, Mr. Kimihiro Ishikani, Director for Multilateral Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, Minasama konnichiwa. My thanks to Minister Kishida for his opening remarks, and my thanks to Japan and Indonesia for sponsoring today's consultations, and to Japan for being such excellent hosts. I'm very pleased to be with you here today at this second regional consultation in the lead up to the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit. We're here because we recognize one thing: global humanitarian action needs to change. We need to work more effectively in every way, from how we raise funds to how we monitor the impact of our work. Last month, I attended the first regional consultation for West and Central Africa, and we will be building here on some of the findings from that event. But this regional consultation is first and foremost about capturing the perspectives, the views, the criticism and constructive suggestions of people in this region of the world. People who live and work here in North and Southeast Asia and who understand what works and what doesn't in humanitarian response. Making sure that your voices are heard is crucial as we work towards the summit in Istanbul. This is a region that not only faces frequent large-scale and recurrent natural disasters, it's a region that has also built a great wealth of knowledge and experience in mitigating their impact, preparing and responding to these events. Many of you in this room can speak firsthand of the lessons you have learned, having been affected by and in responding to emergencies. More than a quarter of the world's conflicts are taking place in this region. And I hope that you will also share your experiences and lessons learned in conflict settings, both past and ongoing, in your deliberations over the next few days, and also focus on what you see as being the future challenges for this region. But let me just remind you that our discussion is not just limited to those of you who are in this room today. Yesterday, for example, I attended the end of the civil society discussions here in Tokyo. During May and June, we collected the views of hundreds of people from across this region via the preparatory consultations organized in all of the participating countries. And 10 days ago, I was able to have an online conversation with 250 people from around the world. I listened to what people think are the priorities and what they think is important to achieve through the World Humanitarian Summit. And I have to tell you that there are a lot of views and a lot of expectations out there. The results of all of this outreach have been collected, consolidated, and have been brought here to Tokyo. Now you have the opportunity to add your contribution to those discussions. And I'm going to urge you to be bold in proposing the changes that are needed. Please be provocative, speak out, debate, and dare I say it, argue. We all want the same thing, to be able to help people in need in the best way possible. We need to be ambitious. We need to think big about the changes that are needed. When we leave this room tomorrow evening, I hope we will have some well-reasoned and inspiring recommendations that we can take forward. Because if you look at the context in which we are doing our work, today's humanitarian landscape is unrecognizable compared to 20 years ago. Global challenges like urbanization, population growth in some countries, environmental degradation, conflict, climate change, and resource scarcity mean that humanitarian needs are rising beyond the capacity of the global humanitarian system to cope. And of course, the costs are rising too, both in terms of numbers of people affected and also in terms of the money that we need. Between 2004 and 2013, humanitarian funding requests nearly doubled from $6 billion to over $10 billion per year. And in that same period, the number of people targeted through interagency appeals rose from approximately 30 million to 70 million. We're seeing recurrent crises that are predictable, but we aren't reacting quickly enough or in a sustained way to break the cycle and prevent those crises. We have the knowledge, we have the information, but we're not doing enough to manage risks and prevent recurrence. We must move away from our current thinking that humanitarian crises are unusual. They aren't. Most humanitarian emergencies are rooted in known risk factors like climatic patterns and long-term geopolitical changes. For example, in the last decade, the protracted crises in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Somalia accounted for half of all requested funding in global humanitarian appeals. When a crisis happens, it tells us a lot about how societies as a whole are structured and how they allocate their resources. When an earthquake or typhoon of similar strength kills tens of thousands in one country, but a dozen in another, it's clear that disasters amplify the effects of inequality, injustice, and weak governance that lead to heightened vulnerability, reduced coping capacity, and the need for external assistance to meet basic survival needs. On the other hand, where governments are accountable to their people and make efforts to mitigate risks, to prepare communities for disaster, and to help them to respond and recover, we see greater resilience. This is what we see in many Asian countries, but we still need to do more. We know, for example, that typhoons will continue to hit the Philippines and Vietnam. But are we doing enough to support the people and communities that will be hit? Even more worrying, the frequency and intensity of shocks and the number of people exposed to them is expected to grow. The number of people living in floodplains in Asia is projected to rise from 30 million to between 83 and 91 million by 2030. That's in the next 16 years. So how do we collectively prepare for and manage this? What changes do countries and communities need to make to manage these shocks by themselves? And how can we, the regional and international community, best support them? How do we serve the needs of people who are caught up in the terror of conflict? As demand for humanitarian action is rising, we also see more types of humanitarian organizations and actors than ever before, from the smallest community-based groups to the largest multinational companies. Humanitarian concerns transcend any single sector and should be the concern of us all. But if we aren't careful, we risk the fragmentation of our global humanitarian system. We need to find ways to make sure we're working in cooperation, not in competition, and working towards the same goals and with the same commitment to the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These changes and challenges require bold and innovative solutions, one of the themes of the World Humanitarian Summit. We need to do more to identify innovations and how they might have a positive impact on our work. We need to propose radically different ways of thinking about humanitarian effectiveness, how and where we can work with others to reduce vulnerability and manage risk. And I hope you will come up with some bold ideas around serving the needs of people who are caught up in conflict. We won't find answers to all the questions that we are raising during this consultation, but I do hope that we will find some. We have seen incremental improvements in the way the humanitarian system works, but we now need a step change. We need to agree on better ways of working together, on communicating with each other and with the people who need our assistance. We need better mechanisms to ensure accountability to the people we support and to our donors. When we consulted affected communities during preparations for this regional consultation about the biggest obstacle they face in getting governments and humanitarian organizations to meet their needs, the most common response was, they don't know the true needs of the community. We need to change this now. We must listen to those who struggle to be heard, young people, the elderly, girls and women, and people living with disabilities. Girls and women in particular must be recognized as vital to ensuring social stability, coherence, and resilience in communities. We need to recast humanitarian action so that it reflects the reality of mutual support and self-interest between countries, not the differences that so often become the focus of international attention. It's beyond time to move on from the era of powerful donors dictating terms to disempowered aid recipients. Humanitarian action must be about cooperation and collaboration between people, between communities, between countries, and between regions. I was delighted to hear in the West and Central Africa consultation about the exchange program on disaster management between ECOWAS and ASEAN. That is exactly the kind of cooperation that we need to build on and replicate. We also need to broaden our ideas about who should be involved in humanitarian work. We need to connect with the wider world. from an evidence base by tracking economic growth and recession, examining the roots of fragility and lack of development, monitoring the impact of climate change, working on scientific innovation and academic analysis, all areas which are important in calculating risk and taking strategic action to reduce vulnerability. And we need to connect our work with ongoing work in other areas, including the close links between the World Humanitarian Summit and the Sendai Conference next March on the successor to the Hyogo Framework for Action. The side meeting, charting the road from Sendai to Istanbul, will be absolutely critical. We also need to align our discussions and outcomes with those of the post-2015 development agenda and the negotiations on climate change. Collectively, they provide a unique opportunity to manage future risks and provide an integrated approach to tackling these challenges. Let me reiterate yet again, Istanbul is a means and not an end in itself. The process leading up to the World Humanitarian Summit and the follow-up afterwards are just as important as the summit itself. We all need to do our part to make sure that these processes are a platform for far-reaching change. We have a long list of issues and challenges before us. Even with discussions planned for the next 18 months around the world, we will only touch on the most important priorities. So we need to make sure that we put in place the framework for a truly radical change to the humanitarian system. Once again, I urge everyone to play a leadership role in taking this important process forward. I encourage you to step out of your comfort zone and think outside the box. This is a unique process. By doing that, I guarantee that the results that we achieve will bring significant and meaningful changes to how we work together and better serve people in need. The Secretary General and I are counting on your support and also on your active engagement. Let me end with a story from the Philippines. A story told by a group of women in a village that had been hit by a typhoon. Humanitarian organizations had brought food, water, shelter, and medicines. But when asked what they needed most, the women pointed at the remains of a bridge that had been washed away in the floodwaters, leaving the village completely cut off from the rest of the area. What we really need is for someone to rebuild the bridge, they said. Then we'll be able to go to our fields and take our produce to market. We'll be able to look after ourselves, and we won't need anyone to bring us aid. We're here today to make sure we listen to people. They know what they need. All we have to do is ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Under-Secretary General Amos. And now we would like to have a question and answer session until 10:45. So could you raise your hands and I will point you, and the person who is pointed is expected to identify yourself and ask questions. So a person who has a question, please raise your hand. Okay, the gentleman over there.
Good morning. My question is to Valerie Amos. You described in your speech that there has to be a better synergy with the other global initiatives, like the Sendai process, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the climate change discussion. Can you please describe what is the mechanism for that to happen? we have been hearing this rhetoric that yes, there has to be a synergy, there has to be a much more uniform view. But what is the mechanism in place that these initiatives, the global initiatives, do not remain the parallel initiatives, the siloed initiative, but they come together? So if you can share the mechanism that's put in place leading up to May 2016, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are different processes which have been put in place. So in the run-up, as you know, to the post-2015 agenda and the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is an intergovernmental process, a set of connected issues were sent via our office, the Office for the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, to the Secretariat and also to the co-chairs of that post-2015 agenda process to try to ensure that particularly the issues around tackling the needs of people in conflict, but also the relationship between humanitarian and development issues, particularly around those questions of managing vulnerability and risk, are taken on board in the development of the next set of sustainable development goals. It does not mean that they will all be taken on board, and my team in OCHA that deal with our relationships through ECOSOC and the General Assembly with member states have been very active in seeking to get those issues integrated into that agenda. With respect to the Sendai conference, again, we produced a paper which went to the planning team, and we have also proposed the holding of a ministerial meeting in the margins of the Sendai conference to make the links between the outcome of the Sendai conference and the World Humanitarian Summit. You will know that the planning is still going on with respect to the conclusions that will come from that World Conference. And on the broader issue of climate change, we have produced recently a paper, basically our kind of global risks paper, which points within that research to the ongoing impact of climate change on humanitarian crises. And we are seeking to ensure that as many countries and participants in that climate change summit appreciate and understand the linkages between the two.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, gentleman over there at the back.
Her Excellency, Ms. Valerie Ramos, I'm Victor Rembet. I'm from Disaster Resource Partnership Indonesia, members of the World Economic Forum. I actually just want to comment that the roles of private sectors in these cooperations, collaborations, you surely know that the RP is there and World Economic Forum works with OCHA and you're a member of the world, but it seems like the presence of the private sectors are not yet clearly heard in some regional, and even we are talking about going to 2016, because we are, as much as others, private sectors have capacity and resources in some ways, and in some places could be more effective and efficient. That we would like to see that, well, keep in mind that all the affected people are stakeholders of private sectors, and we're talking about governments, community, and NGOs and all others, that we would like to see that the presence of private sectors could be more seen in the coming sessions of going toward the 2016. And therefore, because this is something that we do at the profits, I mean, securing the profits means securing the people's welfares, the government's welfares. And therefore, at this point, I would like to point this out to you and also to include more, especially the World Economic Forum or others, private sectors, and disaster resource partnerships, which we have done quite good in Indonesia. I'm representing also in, the government of Indonesia, that we do stakeholders' participations in humanitarian issues. And this is what I would like just to give you a brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are working with as wide a stakeholder base as possible. As I said in my opening remarks, it's very, very important that all of the different actors involved in humanitarian response participate in these regional consultations, but also the discussions that are happening at the national level. The private sector are key partners of many humanitarian organizations around the world. And I would encourage you and any of your other private sector partners that are not here to please engage. The consultation meetings themselves are not the only way in which we are hoping that people will engage in and participate. We have the online consultations, which are absolutely key. We have the thematic themes. We also have 8 regional consultation meetings planned. This is the second of 8. And a number of organizations are themselves hosting consultations or discussions within their countries in the context of ongoing fora that already exist. So I very much want the private sector to be a part of this. We within OCHA have a new partnership branch which includes a team working on private sector issues, so please also engage with them, as well as with the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat.
Thank you. Okay, gentleman on the front.
Good morning to everybody. I'm from Turkey, Director General for Multilateral Political Affairs, also humanitarian issues. We will be the host of the summit, and Turkey is participating in every regional consultation. We are pleased to be here in Japan. It's a great pleasure for us to be here and listening to you in the preparation of the World Humanitarian Summit. I'm not going to make a long speech. What I want to say is that Turkey, the people of Turkey, Istanbul, is looking to host you. Istanbul has been, in fact, a meeting place for all civilizations. It is a meeting place between East and West, between North and South. So we would like to be really preparing the summit in such a way that all human beings from all around the world, not only governments, NGOs, academia, private sector, they are going to be welcomed in Istanbul with a great hospitality. In this context, the only issue I want to raise, with your permission, Ms. Amos, and we are also grateful for your speeches which you have made this morning and leading and guiding us for the summit, that we believe migration should be a cross-cutting issue. Because for all the teams, whatever we are going to do or whatever we are going to fail will be ending up with further migration. This migration will be either voluntary for economic reasons or it will be forced migration in cases of disaster, in cases of conflicts. So I think this migration issue should be a cross-cutting issue that should be dealt with in all the thematic groups and in all the subgroups, working groups of the summit preparation. And therefore, it is important to recognize this important issue and maybe interact with other relevant UN agencies and other NGOs, organizations who are dealing with this issue. So we would be delighted if this idea is also taken on board, and we will be ready to contribute in every way we can for a good summit, for a summit, as you said, will not be an end itself, but will be a turning point for a new kind of humanitarian action, which will have everybody on board, which will have a totally new concept and vision, which will put the human beings at the center of everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Undersecretary Amos, Secretary General Amos.
Thank you. I think we're all looking forward to the summit in Istanbul. And with respect to the issue of migration, of course, migration and a number of other themes will emerge from the consultations. This is very much a people-led process, and I look forward to the conclusions out of this consultation tomorrow.
Thank you. And this morning's session is broadcasted throughout the website, and we do have some questions from the website audience, and let me read out one of the questions, and which is following. Ms. Amos talked about global humanitarian action. How can this be interpreted in terms of developing long-term relationships between NGOs and international organizations? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't think I heard or understood the second part of the question. Long-term?
No, the question is regarding the how can this global humanitarian action that you mentioned be interpreted in terms of developing long-term relationships between NGOs and the international organization?
Those partnerships and relationships are absolutely crucial. NGOs very often are the key implementing partners, for example, for UN humanitarian organizations in the field. We have an interagency process, an interagency standing committee, which is mandated by the UN General Assembly, that brings UN humanitarian organizations together with our NGO partners through consortia, with our partners from the IFRC and the ICRC. So this relationship and engagement is absolutely crucial when we think about how for the future we can make humanitarian response more effective.
Thank you very much. Okay, Deputy Minister Claib.
Thank you. I just would like to add to the first question that has been elaborated very eloquently by Undersecretary General Amos. On the OCHA side, that has been greatly contributed to the discussions on the open working group on sustainable development goals. So I just would like to refer to this question on mechanisms. That indeed now the discussion is going on. I would like to speak on the perspective of the government, of the state parties, state discussion going on. That like Indonesia and Japan, we are working very closely in how to accommodate the concern and the issue of humanitarian affairs, humanitarian issues in the discussion of the post-2015 development agenda. The good thing is we are all in agreement that one of the issues that becoming enabling environment for the development, economic growth is of course how we prepared, how we mitigate the impact of natural disaster. For instance, when we look at Aceh, before we discuss, we talk about MDGs in Indonesia, including in Aceh province. Overnight, we cannot say anymore that Aceh has reached some certain goals on the MDGs because of the tsunami. So it is a kind of enabling environment for economic development. And indeed, in this discussion, we are not only talking about sustainable development per se, but it will be in the three pillars, in the social inclusion, economic development, as well as environmental protections. So rest assured that all of us, countries as well as the UN system, has all put forward, including Indonesia and Japan, working very closely, and we are also one of the co-chair of the high-level panel of the post-2015 development agenda, that we inserted very bold on humanitarian issues in the post-2015 development agenda. It is one of the pillars that need to be addressed by the international community. It is the, before we are talking as well about UNFCCC, about climate change, there will be a kind of environmental migration that at the end of the day, it will also create humanitarian crisis in other parts of the country or in other parts of other neighboring country. So I think rest assured that this issue is very pertinent, and then in September there will be a synthesis report from the Secretary General, and we will look at it, and I'm sure that all the government representatives here are keen enough to continue discussion and make sure that humanitarian issue will be inserted boldly in the post-2015 development agenda. So I think the mechanism exists, and we are working on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, the lady at the back.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Zhao Ying Liang. I'm here to represent a Chinese NGO called Lingzhou Charity, and also an Operation USA, which is an USA NGO. I have some of my opinions and also a question about the humanitarian effectiveness. The good news is that the traditional or brand name developed country charities, which were only in the US, Canada, Europe, and Japan, helped build the capacity to train local people in many countries. So that local charity and the local governments are now ready to shoulder the burden directly rather than the subcontractor of the traditional charity in the developed countries. Resources can now safely be allocated to many countries who are now capable on their own of responding to disaster effectively. And with the economic growth of China, the governments are focusing on to direct humanitarian assistance when it is needed after disasters. And the Gongos gives away the real civil society NGOs and international NGOs. As two charities I'm involved with, one is in China, it's very new, it's 3 years old, and the whole city are mobilized, including the entrepreneurs to make donations, also little children to start to learn about the philosophy at a very young age, which is in their textbook. And the American charity, Operation USA, is a 35 years old charity, which has experiences all over, helping around over 100 countries and delivered around $400 million aids. So I introduced the charity in China to meet the American charity, and they decided to have a partnership because we think that Lingzhou Charity Federation reaching out for the more experienced international charity can cutting down their learning curve. So my question here is for Dr. Amos is that do you encourage new charities in Asia to partner up with experienced international charities to cutting down their learning curve so they can respond to disasters more effectively? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you. Yes, I think it's absolutely crucial that organizations are able to learn from each other and partner with each other.
okay. Gentleman over there.
Good morning. My name is Manu Gupta and I represent a civil society network. This is a general, this is not a question, but just an expectation I would like to place before the panel. While we welcome the national accountability guidelines that have been set in place by the government of Indonesia, one very strong feedback that has been coming from the civil society networks here is that while there is acknowledgement of the need to listen to people, there is still a very wide disagreement on how do we want to carry out this business of listening. And you know, we all have our own ways of interpreting how we want to listen. Does it have to be at organizational level? Does it have to be at the systemic level? And what do we want to listen? And I think this is an expectation we as civil society would like to place before the House here, that we need to discuss that in much more detail than just agreeing to listen to people. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. You have a comment? Okay.
Can I just make a comment on that? Because I think you're absolutely right, but I also think that we are in very grave danger when we look at the issue of accountability to affected people, of trying to push everything into just one way of doing things. And it's not going to work. People are very different. They're very different depending on the country that they're in, the culture that they're from, you know, how they communicate their messages. So it's important that we have some principles that are crucial to us in terms of a recognition of the importance of that listening. But let's not try to, as we do in so many other things when we're doing humanitarian work, try to establish narrow mechanisms for doing this that ultimately have the opposite effect, which is to exclude rather than include. So organizational is important, systemic is important, but people to people is crucial and central.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid to say that time is running out, so I would like to accept last questions. Gentleman over there.
Yes, hello. My name's Brian Kelly. I work with the International Organization for Migration. And just want to say thank you to the Director General from Turkey. Thank you for the Deputy Minister, Undersecretary General, for bringing up the issue of migration so early. Particularly in North, Southeast Asia, we have so many different dynamics that are going on with labor sending countries, labor receiving countries, countries of transit, some countries that are more than one of these at any given time. And it's an issue that touches both with Indonesia and with Japan, and that was really my question for the two gentlemen representing Indonesia and Japan. The Northeast earthquake in Japan really required a lot of thinking and planning in dealing with migrants that were in that part of the country and needed assistance and support as a labor receiving country. And in Indonesia, which is actually the dynamics are shifting, and it's traditionally labor sending, but also transit and starting to receive some migrants more recently. But if I look at it from the labor sending perspective, oftentimes you've dealt with migrants from your country going overseas, perhaps to the Middle East, that then get caught up in conflict. The question that I have for both of you is, are there any broader lessons that you think, when you think of your own citizens that are going overseas and getting caught up in conflict or dealing with migrants that are coming into your country, that could help guide us and make sure that we keep the issue of migrants relevant in all of the different sessions? Because when we have a disaster, we quite often think of internally displaced populations. We quite often think of refugees. But again, I was just so pleased to have you bring up that issue and bring it up early, because it is such an important one. And just wanted to get your thoughts from receiving migrants in Japan affected by the earthquake, or overseas migrants that have been caught up in conflict from Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Deputy Minister Taib first.
Thank you, from representative from IMO, that we are working closely very much in Jakarta indeed. Of course, when we are talking about migrants, there will be a lot of causes why people migrate. One of the issues that Indonesia has is we have much of our Indonesian citizens are actually legal migrant workers outside of the country. Particularly, most of them are in the Middle East, and some of them are also in neighboring countries. But as long as it is legal migrant, that what we have to do is, as we have done so much these days, is to protect their rights, to protect their existence in that country. the issue come out, sometimes the difficulty come out when we are sending those Indonesian workers to one or two countries who are suddenly becoming a conflict zone, like in Syria, literally, and then we have a lot things to do and how to evacuate them. And of course, our embassy is always open there, never be closed. So we try our best how to bring them out for a while. But some of them stay at the homes of their employees. That's on legal migrants. That's more a little bit manageable. But one of the issues is on the irregular movements of persons. That's another story. It's what people will call it as a migrant as well, but sometimes irregular movement of person. People can say it asylum seeker, refugee, or maybe people smuggling things. So that's the things that we work closely, not only between the source, transit, and destination countries, but also in the regional framework. So what we have done is now we, as Indonesia, we are co-chair with Australia. On the Bali process on how to handle the people smuggling, trafficking in persons, and other related transnational organized crimes. So I think on the migrant per se, as legal as possible, that they send abroad to work outside, that we manage well. But sometimes there are some also our citizens who works outside through illegal mechanisms. That's one thing that we are always taking care of as well. But of course, it will be more difficult than a legal status of our migrant outside. But this in Asia, fortunately, we have been working very closely in interstate relationships. So we are managed well. We, as some of Indonesia, also not only now as a source country, but we are also as a transit country, and sometimes becoming, together with the economic growth, and becoming also one of the destination country. So I think it is a cross-cutting issues. It is transnational issues. What we need is working together how to manage, because it is on the basis of humanitarian. They don't want to go if they can stay at home, actually. So I think we are working on it, and then that's what we have been doing. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ms. Valerie Amos and Hassan Kleib. As someone who's representing the government of Japan, I would like to just propose one thing. That is, to the mainstreaming of disaster-related issues in the upcoming agenda of post-2016. I'm not saying that because I'm a person coming from a country which is pretty much disaster-prone, but the natural disaster could really, destroy the basics of economic development, which we have witnessed in many parts of the world. And in this age of globalization, natural disaster could have an impact all over the world. And those who go through the most difficult part is the most fragile person. That is, ladies, children, aged person, or disabled, or the migrant or foreigners. So how to address these issues, should be one of the main topic when we discuss the post-2016. And of course, the resources which we can put into this process is pretty much limited. So the effectiveness, enhancing the effectiveness is a key word. I think the answer for that is networking and coordination. There are many various actors which are on the ground. It's not only government, NGOs, private sectors, and also regional organizations like ASEAN. So how to network all these, various actors, networking for knowledge sharing, networking for experience sharing, networking for relief activities and so forth. This is extremely important. But on top of that, coordination is also key. When we network those various actors, there should be a better coordination. I think this responsibility put on the shoulder of a lady here, Valerie Amos. But these are the things which we would like to really, discuss and promote in the upcoming discussions up to post 2015-16. Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry, I just would like to refer to the last question. To be fair, I would like also to pose a question. Not a question to be answered right now, but if you can in these 2 days, can also discuss this issue. Madam Amos has stated clearly, I stated clearly, and some of you stated clearly. What kind of, since I'm not referring to the government official because we have been working so much with them, but from the other stakeholders who are here, the private sector, the civil society representative, the NGOs, because it's need a partnership. How to enhance or what kind of mechanism to increase that we, as a government, more listening to the people in the local area. I think in any disaster, what we need is we need to know urgently what the local needs and what their interests are. Because on humanitarian to be effective should be demand driven. It's not supply driven. For instance, I don't want to refer to one issue, but if their countries, their locals need a blanket and medicines, but so many countries has already bought some blankets and they send it anyway. What they need is not a blanket. They have already a lot of bundles of blankets. What they need a kind of medicine. If they need, they have the medicine, they need a blanket. So how a kind of mechanism at the partnership between the government and other stakeholders in increasing the knowledge to be effectively learned and listen what the locals needs and interests. So if you can in these 2 days come up with the kind of mechanism that will be greatly contributed to our region as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of all the participants here, that I would like to thank all the high-level representatives for your very valuable inputs, which will surely guide us for constructive discussions today and tomorrow, and including the questions that Deputy Minister just raised, how that we can make humanitarian assistance effective. And so let me conclude this session, and it is my pleasure to invite you to join us for group photo session, which will be held the next to this auditorium in the reception hall. Upon entering the reception hall, please follow the instruction of the organizing team who are waiting for us there. And after the group photo, we will have a morning coffee break. And then we will meet back here at 11:15 sharp. Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you please to take your seats? We're running a little bit behind time. I don't want to name names, but I will. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Closer, I'm almost eating it. It's not loud enough? How's that? Okay, now I have no hands. All right, could you please take your seats? Let's get started if we can. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. The first thing I'm going to suggest that you may wish to do, for the gentlemen at least, is take off your jackets. I'm going to, because I think the formal part of the process has been done. Now it's time for us to get down to some really solid work. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take my jacket off. That's a bit more comfortable. Can you, I understand the sound is maybe not so good. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, okay, then let me kick off with this second session and sort of the first formal working session. Welcome back to the hall. I hope you've all had a good break and a bit of a chance to meet some new people out there in during the coffee break, and that you're feeling energized after our three speakers and the question and answer session before the break this morning. Now, before I present a little bit, and really it's a very little bit, on the very broad stakeholder analysis that you have been given copies of, I want to just maybe make one or two points about sort of the format of the consultation going forward. Just to reinforce, and it's been said several times before, this is a multi-stakeholder discussion, it's a multi-stakeholder consultation. It's not a sort of formal intergovernmental process. So we're all here as individuals. Of course, we represent interests, we represent constituencies, but we really in this room, we want a kind of flat meeting, which is everybody has an equal right to speak, everybody has an equal voice as we go through today, and as we go into the workshops later today and during the course of tomorrow. And I think really what we want to try and make sure that we do, and perhaps what we steer away from, what we do is to have a conversation, a discussion, which kind of means we want to steer away from long statements, which are sort of formally prepared, and really have discussions that take us forward. Valerie said, please be bold, please be provocative. I was talking to a few colleagues during the coffee break, and they said, we like that. That's something we're going to do. So I would encourage that. We need to be bold and provocative. We've asked the facilitators and the rapporteurs working with you in the workshops to really promote a true dialogue in two ways. One, by keeping you focused, and two, by really maybe asking some questions which are going to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, thinking a little bit outside, being a little bit outside their comfort zones, and so on and so forth. And I think similarly, myself, Takeshi Ito, and Masni Ezra, who are going to be your MCs over the next couple of days, are going to very politely cut people off if they go on for too long. So you are warned that we're going to try and keep things relatively tight. That may not be comfortable for some people, that process, and I'm sorry about that, but I really think, we've designed this consultation to promote multi-stakeholder dialogue, multi-stakeholder discussion. Before we go to our five panelists, and I'll introduce them, if I may, as they come up to speak, I have the somewhat unenviable task of trying to give you a sort of 10-minute overview of the multi-stakeholder consultation results. You've had this blue document, I think, this morning. I'm going to have a go now at trying to just pull out some of the key highlights that we've seen. Certainly not all-encompassing, but as much as possible, a sort of a relatively decent overview. And I'm going to see if the clicky thing works. Yes. Okay, we're in a good place. This is a little high. So I think what we saw coming out of this multi-stakeholder consultation was really sort of four big points, which I'm going to kick off with. I mean, basically, it seems that the main focus of humanitarian action in the region, and this is actually quite a good thing, is really on the needs of the people who've been affected by disasters and crises. This is, of course, how it should be. But we didn't really, I think, manage to dig down into much of detail on that beyond those sorts of fairly high-level statements. There was a very strong recognition across the board that CSOs, local non-governmental organizations, play a really important role in meeting the needs of these people. But I think at the same time, what we also saw was that resources and access to key decision-making for those groups remain somewhat removed, somewhat separate, and that is problematic. We see that host governments are playing an increasingly central role in managing response operations. And this is, I think, music to everybody's ears, particularly when it comes to disaster management. When it comes to conflicts, it leads to some very interesting situations, and not always those that are most positive, particularly when an authority is a party to a conflict. And that is nothing new, but I think it's interesting to have that perspective reinforced. And increasingly, what the international and regional entities are being asked to do is to support national leadership, to provide resources, but increasingly to provide know-how, experience, and knowledge transfer. That seems to be the increasing call that is coming. And I think the sense also coming from the stakeholder analysis was that we're struggling with that a little bit, trying to work out what this changing regional environment means to the regional and international players. And I think we'll hear more about that from some of our panelists today. So very quickly, we had 9 constituent groups that were involved in the consultation across the 16 countries that are involved in this consultation. That is the 10 member states of ASEAN, plus Japan, China, the Republic of Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Mongolia, and Timor-Leste. These are our 16 countries involved in this consultation. 691 respondents from across the nine constituencies, and 42% of those respondents were quote-unquote local actors. I find the word actors difficult: CSOs, communities, and so on and so forth. You will read in the document why this is not a scientific survey, and it's not. With the time that we had and the resources that we had, we couldn't make it completely scientific. But I think we can all acknowledge that that document that you have provides some quite interesting and rich data and information that we can use to really support the work that we do during the course of the rest of today and into tomorrow, and probably, in fact, beyond that. These were the constituencies. We had, as I say, 691 respondents. Large number of those from quote-unquote humanitarian country teams and disaster management teams. These are sort of the UN-led entities at country level, sort of international humanitarian organizations. A very large number from civil society organizations, through country-level workshops and surveys, and so on down the list. You can see here how we also manage those. For member states, there was a workshop that took place in New York in May, and there have been various other mechanisms that have been used. And the reason it's not scientific is that we could not apply the same methodology right the way across all of those constituencies. Different constituencies decided to deal with the questions that we were asking in very different ways. So that is sort of one of the reasons why it's not so scientific. Very interesting spread. The 2 largest countries included in the region have the 2 largest sets of results, that is China and Indonesia. And again, you can see the figures down the right-hand side of this chart. It's good to know that all 16 countries that are represented in the North and Southeast Asia meeting were, to some extent or another, consulted. But those consultations are very broad. Another reason why we cannot say that this is a particularly scientific survey. The survey was very much based on the 4 areas that we are looking at as part of this consultative process leading up to the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. So I'm going to run through a very few highlights from each of those four constituencies. The first one, of course, so those 4 areas for discussion, not constituencies. First, humanitarian effectiveness. You can see these are kind of the key points that came up: leadership of host governments, the engagement of local actors or local organizations, focus on affected people, a participation or inability to participate in humanitarian coordination. The Interagency Standing Committee came up, and if there are people in the room who don't know what the Interagency Standing Committee is, that may be why the Interagency Standing Committee came up. We'll delve down a little more into that. Engagement of regional organizations, context-specific tools and approaches, effectiveness and accountability, of course, and humanitarian funding. A few highlights from this grouping. I think on the issue of sort of government leadership, the survey really showed a need for sort of strengthened leadership by governments of affected states. And as I said, that international support and cooperation should really support, should assist them in this leadership role. Second sort of big issue that came up was about humanitarian coordination mechanisms that are set up after disasters, generally kind of the ones that support rapid response by international and regional actors. and the sense that these were somewhat disconnected and governments had a difficult time accessing and getting into and being a part of, and where possible, leading these mechanisms. This came up quite strongly. And I think the feeling was from the discussion that, we need to rethink this whole issue of what good coordination means, and we need to think about regulatory frameworks at national level which support that sort of coordination. We have examples of this, I think, in the Philippines and Indonesia, where those sorts of legislative frameworks are being put into place. And I think it's worth noting from that graph that the stakeholders really identified that the government, which is sort of represented on the right-hand side of that chart if you can't see it, really is the most effective overall respondent. On local actors, 78% of the respondents really said that the actions that are taken at the local level tend to be the most effective, but that only a very small percentage, 11% of the stakeholders, felt that those actors were adequately resourced to do the job, which basically means there's a recognition of the need still for regional and international support. It's how that is delivered that seems to be one of the key questions. Big questions again around the issue of coordination, and some very interesting perception challenges here, where humanitarian country team responders said, yep, we are open to participation by civil society organizations. Civil society organizations said it's very difficult for us to access these internationally led coordination mechanisms. So there's a perception issue here that we, I think, have to deal with. So yes, those need to be more accessible, and we need to sort of start thinking more about us working together than a sort of them and us scenario. There was also some discussion about the need to restructure the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the sort of oversight body chaired by Valerie, who was here this morning, which consists of the large humanitarian NGOs and UN agencies working together. But it was created in 1991. The membership has not changed significantly since then. There may be some need to rethink that as part of the process leading up to the summit. And also a feeling that regional organizations don't right now have a place at the coordination table. They may be creating one, but actually how that plus international plus national fit together remains remarkably unclear. On reducing vulnerability and managing risk, these were kind of the issues that came up. The need for a mindset shift, I think, by humanitarians on how we look at and how we focus on disaster risk reduction. Better clarity on who's supposed to do what in this arena. Again, leadership of governments, improving the evidence base, tailoring disaster risk reduction to local needs, funding for disaster risk reduction, accountability for disasters that recur again and again, and this famous link between the humanitarian and development processes that certainly since I've been working in this business is something that we've been talking about. And that's a long time. I think what's interesting here for those people who were involved in the Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction that took place in Bangkok 2 months ago, a lot of what is here is there. And I think, Valerie was talking about trying to join these processes up during her presentation this morning, I think in response actually to the question from our colleague from IFRC. And it's clear that a lot of the things that we see here are already being captured as part of the Hyogo Framework for Action 2. I don't know if that's what it's called, but the successor agreement or the complementary agreement to the currently existing Hyogo Framework for Action. So I'm not going to run through these in any great detail, but I think, a few interesting issues. Everybody said it's really important to consider disaster risk reduction in programming. 18% of respondents said that they actually did it. So a relatively small number versus the aspiration that it should be done. Again, the survey results said it's very important to tailor DRR to local requirements. Only 5% of respondents said that they actually consulted with communities when it came to how to build disaster risk reduction into their programs. There was also a feeling, I think, that who's responsible is slightly muddled at both the international and national levels in some places. Who's actually accountable for this whole issue of risk management, risk reduction, and so on and so forth. That may be something that we want to unpick in the workshops. And again, this issue of accountability came up, but not in any very firm or coherent manner. oh, I'm one slide behind, I beg your pardon. Transformation through innovation. I guess two sort of big pieces came up here, but there's a fair old list. Engaging with local CSOs and affected communities. Different interests in innovations amongst national and international actors. And very much coming up, perhaps because it's easy, is this issue of innovation and communication. You know, the mobile phone is the answer to everything that we want to do in humanitarian affairs, or is it? Private sector partnerships came up, consideration of megatrends, and the flexibility of humanitarian tools and mechanisms as they stand right now. I guess the first piece of the analysis was quite interesting. You know, the pre-consultation workshops and the surveys strongly identified the need for engagement with affected communities and local CSOs in searching for innovations that are best tailored to meet needs at the local level. But as you can see from this chart here, the interest in research for innovations is much lower amongst local CSOs than amongst international organizations. And I think we're going to have to identify a way to either bridge that or find out why that is. Is that because there's greater exposure to this new sexy concept of innovation at the international level than at the local level? Or is it something more difficult for us to deal with than that? When it comes to issues of information and communication, you know, these were seen as having the biggest potential in improving disaster response. But I wonder a little bit whether this is just because it's obvious. Everyone says, oh, yeah, that's an easy, low-hanging fruit that we can look at. You know, use of group SMS and mobile technology was regarded as an efficient way for real-time data collection. But it's not new. This is not new. It's been going on for some time. So is this still something that's actually innovative? A lot of discussion around how we retain knowledge and perhaps use innovation to retain knowledge, particularly given relatively high turnover of staff in civil services, in disaster management agencies, and so on and so forth. A lot of discussion around how we bridge our relationship with the private sector on innovation. It's already happening at the organizational level, which I think is regarded as extremely positive. The issue is whether it's happening at the system level, which I think is far less clear. On serving the needs of people in conflict, I think nothing new came up, but there was a lot of elaboration of some of the issues that we know are already there, and which I hope the workshop groups are going to be able to touch on as we go forward into that session after lunch today. Neutrality and impartiality. Trying to better understand the needs of people in conflict, which is what this session is about. It's not just about conflict, it's about understanding and serving the needs of people in conflict. The role of local actors, local organizations in conflict situations. The role of governments. The issue of access, humanitarian action and peace building, those relationships, partnerships in conflict, and security of staff. And I think on understanding the needs, everybody agreed that there's a need for sort of better analysis of needs in conflict. And that includes understanding the roots of those conflicts and the dynamics. We have a responsibility to understand better the environment in which we are working. And of course, the sense was when people were asked who understands best, again, it was organizations that come from that country or from that community. There was also a sense that we don't have roles and responsibilities really clearly defined. And that is problematic. Something around the fact that we have disaster management laws at national level, we don't seem to have anything equivalent when it comes to dealing with or addressing conflicts, and this is something that we should start to think about and look at. Certainly out there in IHL, are we bringing that into down to the national level? A sense that humanitarians actually need to be doing more to ensure their impartiality and neutrality, and that you know, we have this notion of impartiality and neutrality applying to everybody. It applies most of all to the organizations that are providing assistance. In order for them to do their job, they have to remain impartial and neutral, and are we actually doing all that we can to do that? A call for the elimination of government-imposed restrictions on the provision of humanitarian aid in conflict situations, which I think is, again, nothing new. And attention should really be reinforced on humanitarian staff security. And we particularly need to look at the staff security of local actors who we often use to deliver assistance in places that we find it difficult to get to ourselves. So those are kind of the very brief high-level analyses, and I'm sure I've done a relatively poor job of trying to dig down into the wealth of information and data that's being gathered. I think most people in this room participated somehow in this process, so thank you very much indeed for doing so. Just to return, I think sort of the key trends across all of the themes: leadership of governments in humanitarian action, this importance of our colleagues working in civil society organizations, local organizations, and of course the people who are affected by themselves, and we perhaps sort of take this somewhat for granted. We talk about it, but what does it really mean? For pretty much everything, better collection, sharing of information and data. I don't think this is restricted to the humanitarian system. This is a problem that we all face, this avalanche of information that we have to deal with. How do we streamline it? How do we make it easier to access and to use? And I think for everybody, this issue of how do we work together more effectively, the need for strengthened partnerships, and often going beyond who we regard sort of comfortably now as part of the humanitarian system. You know, where are the edges of that system? It's perhaps good that those edges are not too clearly defined, but we do need to work out how we can work together more effectively within that system. And we also need to think about who needs to be part of that system who currently isn't, formally. And at the same time, I think this call for increased accountability, increased effectiveness. And of course, there's been a discussion around accountability and effectiveness for many years. The fact that we are still calling for improved accountability and effectiveness, I think, means that what we have in place is not sufficiently robust. And this really needs to be something that we look at as we move towards 2016. So that is basically what I have for you. I'm sorry it was very brief, although not brief enough. I'm now going to, if I may, hold questions until, on this part, until we've heard also from our 5 colleagues who are going to elaborate a little more on their perspectives on the stakeholder analysis, and also the views that they hold as individuals who are involved in this humanitarian work that we do. So I'll introduce them one by one as they come up to speak. Our first stakeholder representative is from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's Deputy Secretary General for ASEAN Social Cultural Community, Alicia de la Rosa Bala. And if I can note, before she was appointed the DSG, Ms. Bala served as the Undersecretary of the Department of Social Welfare and Development in her home country, the Philippines. And I think she's going to bring her own perspective and experience as a national disaster management official in one of those countries, as well as her current regional role. So DSG, if I can invite you to take the stage. Apparently I'm in charge of the PowerPoint, so I will...
Okay. Hello. Okay. Excellencies, is it working? Do I hear you? Okay. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Assalamu alaikum. The humanitarian challenges ahead appear daunting, which include, among others, connecting disaster situations with the need for sustainable development, creating jobs, and looking at changing lifestyles and new norms and definitions of resilience and its impacts on government systems and institutions, on the vulnerable and most affected populations and humanitarian actors. For the ASEAN, the year 2015 culminates in the formal start of an ASEAN community that is characterized to be a caring and sharing society, but we are also conscious that our region is located in a very strategic geopolitical area of the world, with some $2 trillion in GDP representing almost 2% of the world's GDP and almost 10% of the world's population, and one of the most vulnerable regions when it comes to disasters and the impacts of climate change. Now, let me share to you my perspectives on 2 critical areas when we speak of ASEAN. One, what is the humanitarian goal of ASEAN? ASEAN has a strong and clear intent to collectively respond to disasters faster and better, which is in line with the main elements of a post-2015 vision, such as socially responsible, people-centered, and people-oriented, which were adopted by the ASEAN leaders in 2013. Building a disaster-resilient society is one of the most important principles behind the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, which provides the policy framework, the structures, the operational means to reach out to the most affected through advancing the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center, boosting the ASEAN Secretary General's function as Regional Humanitarian Assistance Coordinator, and set up a responsive infrastructure mechanism and stakeholder partnership. Then the second part is the role of organizations, of regional organizations. Regional organizations will assume more and more roles and responsibilities in facilitating and coordinating humanitarian assistance in the region as they serve as an effective bridge between the international and national mechanisms. To be successful in assuming more responsibilities, the international organizations should play a supporting role to enhance the capacity of the countries and the regional organization so they can assume more leadership roles and responsibilities. The criteria for success for partnership between the international organizations and the regional organizations is when the capacity of the regional is increased and can become the first choice of response in support to the member states' internal assets and capacities when disasters strike. Now, there are three main areas where we put our strategic directions, which is linked with the ongoing debate on the post-Hugo framework for action and the post-MDGs Development Agenda 1. National resilience. Countries in the ASEAN are now becoming to be more assertive, resilient, and a disaster may not immediately prompt requests for international assistance because the capacity within the countries are stronger and the expertise, experience, and knowledge are available locally and regionally. And there is the perception, attitude of shift from asking for international assistance to welcoming assistance. There is now a growing capacities of disaster management professionals in the region compared to 10 years ago, based on our experience from the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the 2008 Cyclone Nargis in 2008, and the most recent Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. Innovative governance. They construct and redesign coordination mechanisms which reduce information gaps, institutional coordination between first responders, policy, and research centers to be reassessed, and with the results localized, field-tested, and with risk-affected communities be engaged. ASEAN should intensify its focus on creating connections before disasters occur and expanding the region's stakeholders and partnership base, and should be continued on emphasis building bridges across sectors. The regional system can become the focal point in spurring integration and coordination, and that local context, culture, norms, and dialogue need to be injected in our future interventions, taking into consideration restoring the dignity of peoples who were victims, survivors of disasters. And the third, humanitarian conflict. There are new elements of the future humanitarian system that need to be further studied that would include the following: new capacity building approaches for new skills and competencies, performance measurements that uphold accountability, embracing transparency and participation, new code of conduct applicable for all actors, and adaptive research in engagement, removing barriers, and risk analysis. In the context of ASEAN, we will use the appropriate mechanisms such as ADMER or other mechanisms to the humanitarian effects of natural and man-made disasters, regardless whether they happen in conflict areas or not. Disasters do not choose the areas or the people. We cannot turn our back on them. The imperative is addressing the humanitarian needs and not on resolving the political issues or conflicts. In a way, ASEAN countries have successfully undertaken this approach for the response to Aceh tsunami, which was then a conflict area, or Nargis in Myanmar, where we strictly said that our response and that of the international community should only focus on the affected population. Respect of the sovereignty of the affected country is an important principle and engenders confidence to respond to the disasters using their national capacities should always be encouraged. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me the opportunity to become part of this event. And I hope that my sharing with you from the perspective of a regional organization, ASEAN as one of the most fast-growing region in the world. Thank you and good morning again.
DSG Bala, thank you very much indeed for that very useful and incisive overview. We really appreciate it. The second stakeholder representative who's speaking as a member of this interagency standing committee that I spoke of before is Mr. Kunio Senga, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Save the Children Fund Japan. Prior to joining Save the Children, Mr. Senga spent nearly 30 years at the Asian Development Bank, so he knows about money, and brings a wealth of experience in the region, but also from the development community to bear. So please, let me pass the floor to you, Mr. Senga. And I will put your slide up. Ooh.
Thank you so much indeed for giving me opportunity to participate in this discussion. I represent the regional members of the interagency subcommittee, standing committee. I'd like to first share the view of this group as captured in the recent discussion, and I'd like to then give my own perspective on the way forward to respond to this view. Interagency Standing Committee was established in 1992, essentially to serve as the primary mechanism for interagency coordination relating to humanitarian assistance. Its members are UN agency, Red Cross, and international NGOs. We believe that incredible experience was built up and a major achievement have been demonstrated. We have an average age of 50 years, operating under a set of rules and regulation and standards. We are quite diverse, and many of us are big global institutions, and so very slow to change sometimes. We do recognize an increasing number of humanitarian actors outside of the framework of the Interagency Standing Committee. Key point raised by this group prior to this Tokyo meeting are quite useful and reasonable in my view. Point one, the focus of the international actor should be on supporting host countries, host government in leading humanitarian response. That's fine, but I did not see much substantive discussion on supporting to affected and vulnerable community and CSO on the ground. Point number two, this group finds it necessary to reform the structure of interagency structure to allow more participation by governments and key actors. Again, that's fine, but is intended reform sufficient enough? We have seen incremental attempt at change, but they are not working well, in my view. The other point covering the importance of disaster preparedness, neutrality in conflict situation, and so on. Again, that's fine. However, I must believe that we have to ask ourselves a fundamental and overarching question, that is the history and experience of the Interagency Standing Committee an asset or a burden or barrier to change? Are we the old guard and 20th century guard? I believe that rather than adapting and tweaking the current system, we need to be much bolder and to envision something that is fit to address future challenges such as climate change disaster. Essentially, we have to ask if this group is responsive, relevant, and results-oriented. We need to be responsive in changing circumstances and needs. We now see that affected community and national and local government are effective responders in the region in particular. Our role must be changing. How can we better respond to support these actors? What if a new system and coordination mechanism were designed by these actors? Relevant. Are we relevant now that the number and range of local responders increase? The international mechanism and the regional mechanism become less central or pivotal for the humanitarian response. Relevance should not be judged by us, but by our stakeholder as part of being accountable to those who we serve. Have we listened to our stakeholder effectively? Result orientation. We have to ask ourselves how we are measuring our own performance. It's easy to measure the number of people we reach and the amount of money we spend after a disaster. How about measures for impact and development goals in ensuring that humanitarian events don't throw development off track? We should be measuring these types of results and impact. So there are many tasks to carry out, and in this context, we must break down some barriers. Humanitarian agencies are quite good at talking to each other, but not so good at engaging other actors in the development cycle. Humanitarian response, development assistance, and the disaster risk management are still isolated. We should consider our overall assistance in phases of emergency, recovery, reconstruction, and development with risk management as a cycle. Then, the roles and responsibility of each actor within each phase must be clearly defined and activity and funding fully coordinated. Engage the next generation. Have we not completely forgotten one critically important group of actors? Children and the youth. Children and young people face long-term challenges ahead. We should help build the awareness of issues like climate change adaptation and encourage innovation from an earlier age. We know that the children and young people are much more innovative than adults. One concrete example from Vietnam is the floating backpack. It's designed to serve not only as a school backpack, but as a life jacket during the flood. It is based on an original design of an 11-year-old boy from northern Vietnam. Another example is in Haiyan response in the Philippines last year. Save the Children, World Vision Plan, and UNICEF worked together to ask children what they want, what they need, and what they recommend. In the process, we learned a lot about what and how we should have had responded better. Here in Japan, children in the Tohoku region after disaster spoke up, and they started rebuilding their town at their own initiative. This raised the greater question of how accountable we currently are to children, the next generation. So I have to ask you today, will there be children engaged in the World Humanitarian Summit process? Why not? What can this region teach other regions about how we have partnered with children and young people? In concluding, ladies and gentlemen, I appeal to all of you, listen to our stakeholders, including children, learn from them, and support them to address the problem and the risk they face on the ground. Thank you very much.
Kunio, thank you very much. I mean, we were asked before the break to be bold, and I think there's some very, very bold stuff there. So thank you very much indeed for putting that out there. Our third person in this session is representing local civil society, and I'd like to introduce Ms. Fei Lee. Fei is from the Korean NGO Council for Overseas Development Cooperation, KCOC, and she has 15 years of experience in relief and development in the non-governmental sector. So Fei, can I invite you to the rostrum? And I will put up your slide for you.
I need to readjust.
Can I help you?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this important, significant event, especially for me to represent CSO constituencies, encompassing local CSOs and national CSOs and then CSO networks. He's having a hard time. Maybe I can just hold it. Okay, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. So as we already, as presented in the previous session, those, as you can see from the previous presentations, it was very interesting that over 3/4 of survey respondents indicated that local and national actors respond most effectively to the needs of affected communities, both in the natural disaster and also in conflict setting, as they have better understanding the needs of the communities. So there is we can see there is a strong recognition that CSOs play a very significant role in humanitarian affairs, and therefore their engagement should be expanded. But somehow, the local CSOs are not well represented or engaged in coordination structure, like cluster system and then humanitarian country team and etc. So there is a certain reason why is that. So, and then regarding this, CSOs have identified their main challenges engaging in coordination as the lack of information shared by former humanitarian system and the language barriers and the unwelcoming nature of the former humanitarian system. So as Oliver already shared that there is 60% of the humanitarian country team believe that they are really open to participation of local CSOs. Only just like 24% of the CSO respondents share the view. So this is the area we need to explore the reasons. Why is that? Some of the challenges commonly found that CSOs face in delivering disaster response and implementing disaster risk reduction projects is the shortage of funding and the lack of internal capacity, such as knowledge and technical expertise, and then lack of opportunities to partner with different actors and information sharing among the actors. So these are the very classic barriers: capacity and then funding issues and then partnership issues. So among some of these challenges identified from the survey, and those regarding the information sharing and communication could be tackled through the improved use of information and communication technology, such as mobile phones and the internet and social media. And then I'm representing also Korean NGO Council for Overseas Cooperation. Korea and Japan are relatively kind of non-Western newcomers to this international humanitarian society. So we have a lot of challenges in how we deal with the new small voluntary group of all diverse actors. So, and then that kind of case is really hindering some of our coordination challenges. So we had a real small example of how we utilize the mobile communication in the use of our coordination. We actually had opened up a mobile group chatting during the Typhoon Haiyan, and then it really allowed for real-time chatting. So it's more like 60 people at the same time, both based in Seoul or in the Philippines or anywhere else, trying to share all those important information, including cluster meeting schedules and the logistic information things. So that was kind of improved our CSO own coordination and also the communication as well. Just to highlight some of my personal reflection from the key findings, I just wanted to ask the questions. The question didn't actually, it actually stuck. Why? Why do CSOs not participate in the coordination system? Is there any issues? Are there any issues overlooked? So I just wanted to point out the point of issue of partnership and enabling environment for CSOs. In spite of increased recognition on the important role of CSOs in humanitarian assistance, many of local CSOs in the region are not still treated in equal and inclusive partnership with their own governments and international organizations, and sometimes mega-sized NGOs. The relationship of local CSOs with other actors seems to be more parentalship than the partnership. So we say partnership, but we actually read it more like parentalship, because CSOs have lack of capacity, lack of resources. So if local CSOs are truly considered as most effective in responding to the needs of affected, then enabling environment for CSOs to be ensured in ways to empower them to overcome the classic barriers with which local CSOs have been faced. This enabling environment, I can actually refer to the CSO consensus on the international framework for CSO development effectiveness. It's also another CSO consultation process, took for about 2 years process. So there was conditions for those CSOs to be more empowered is that recognizing CSOs as actor in their own right, and then CSO have to be also part of the democratic political policy dialogue to improve their own effectiveness. And then the policy has to be also accountable and then transparent in close line with the development and also humanitarian sector combining two. And then creating enabling financing for CSO effectiveness. So these are the areas that we can talk about when you say enabling environment. This could be the areas. And then there's also is there any newcomers, new local organizations, new non-Western CSOs, Asia-based organizations, why they are not welcome? So one of the barriers for local CSOs to participate in the coordination system, which I say cannot be overlooked, is the unwelcoming nature of the system. I think there could be a lot of reasons. They are not so familiar with the formal system that has been already developed by the traditional, typical humanitarian actors. And in many cases, those cluster systems and the coordination system focusing mainly on very large scale of project by united UN organizations and or large-sized organizations. In that case, for small and then local organizations or non-Western CSOs, it's very difficult for them to participate and give their voices in the cluster system. So unless they are the implementing partners of the United Nations or other big organizations. So this is some of the issues can be also, we can think of why is there. What is it the area we need to change? Is the competence of the humanitarian workers or some of the system issues? The systems are not actually fully embracing them, or is it the behavior or attitudes of the traditional humanitarian workers? So we have to think more about this. And okay, so Yeah, I think these two questions are already that I can actually throw to the floor, so we can all think together. And then the other ways that I came with how we improve coordination and communication is that one way I could suggest is the working in order to reach out to all the local CSOs. It would be better to work with a CSO network in the certain region or in certain countries or the community. So that can be one of the way we reach out to the local CSOs in the cluster system. I think I have consumed all my time. So.
Thank you, Faye, very much. But
Thank you very much.
Very useful information. Thank you. So I think some very coherent comments there about some of the challenges that the CSO community faces. Thank you very much indeed for rescuing that. So the next speaker, we have two more speakers to go. The next speaker is representing the private sector and is actually a member of the regional steering group that helped to bring this whole process together. His name is Mr. Butch Meli, and Butch is the president of the Philippines Disaster Recovery Foundation, which is it's a major private sector vehicle and coordinator for disaster management in the Philippines, and has really been actually very instrumental in coordinating business support, particularly to Typhoon Haiyan response, to the relief and recovery efforts there. But I think also has a much broader remit and agenda. So, Butch, I think it'd be great to hear from you now, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Last night, I flew here through a typhoon, and that underscored two things: the urgency of what we're doing here in Tokyo. But the second thing it underscored was that my fear of upsetting Oliver was stronger than my fear of flying through the typhoon.
Thank you.
But if you'll go through the 3 points here, the private sector budgets, or CSR budgets, pure donations, are always limited. So you can't rely on them. Private companies will give, but they'll only give so much. I think what you really have to do to unleash the private sector is to tap the self-interest that's at the heart of a private company. That's why we're there, that's why we operate. And what we've come up with is the idea is that if you have a disaster area, why not create incentives for private companies to invest in these areas? Why not create something called the economic free trade zones, which already exist in many developing countries? In these zones, there are no taxes for the first 4 to 6 years. There's a 5% tax on the gross revenues after that. They help attract foreign companies to operate there. So why not do this? It's a quick win for the governments involved. There's some revenue lost, but the whole economic muscle of the private sector is going to be there, because the real importance is that they can create jobs. And in many of these disaster areas, like Tacloban, there's no reason to live there. The infrastructure is destroyed. Half the population has already left or been killed. So why would somebody want to live there unless there are jobs? And that's, I think, something that we have to focus on. And I think that's one area where the private sector can help. But it will only come in if there are incentives, even to the point that in certain countries we should try and offer foreign companies something like 25-year leases so that they can operate in these areas. And we shouldn't just focus on export-oriented industries, which is the main focus for these economic free trade zones. Why not include domestic producers, companies that produce for the domestic market? Because they'll want to operate there, especially if there are no taxes for the first few years. And I think the whole economy will be lifted. The government, in the end, will gain more in revenues if that area starts to produce more income. So that's one suggestion from us. The second suggestion is that if we can come out of Tokyo with just an idea that we should all work together towards a pre-agreement, and we got this from there's a Japanese system in which there's a pre-agreement between the different actors, the government, the private sector, the military, the international agencies. If we can come out with some kind of formal pre-agreement among ourselves, that if a disaster strikes, it's not really if, it's when a disaster strikes, that help will come, that we will all try to help according to our ability. It would be a big thing, and if we would all sign off on that, maybe the effect is more symbolic than practical, but maybe it will help save lives as well. So if we can come out with some kind of formal agreement coming from Tokyo and maybe Istanbul, that we're all going to work together, I think that's going to be a big help for everybody, including all the many actors in this room. The third and last point I want to make is that we've already started doing this, is that we realize now that for mega cities, cities that are very congested and that are struck by disasters like major earthquakes or super typhoons, we've seen that in the Philippines, and we realize that we need to build alternate hubs or command centers outside the cities. For example, in areas by seaports where help can come in, or airfields outside the cities where planes come in with relief goods. And we've already started to work on that. The private sector is trying to do it, and we're trying to make sure that it's insulated from politics. Because one thing that we realize is that with both local governments and national governments is that they change. Every time there's an election, there's a new group of people, and then they have a whole new system, and they have whole new names in the boxes, and they even have a whole set of new boxes. So it's difficult to have the continuity that you want. I know that many multinationals are already doing this. So we'd like to do it, and we're going to actually try and physically create these command centers or alternate hubs outside major cities so that not just businesses, but governments can continue to function if a major disaster strikes. One point I didn't put in there is that I think the private sector is an incubator for innovation, both in text messaging for warnings and in text messaging to raise money, which we've been doing over in the Philippines to a certain degree. Also in the area of electronic cash transfers, there are a number of case studies. We're getting money to people in affected communities through mobile ATMs, and electronic cash transfers helps prevent fraud and greater security, and it's a quicker way to reach the people in these areas. Lastly, I just want to say, if there's one thing I've learned from all the many disasters that hit the Philippines last year, a major earthquake, a super typhoon, and one area of some major fighting, it's that what we've seen is that one person can make a difference. And so if we all work together, I think we can all help make this a better world. Thank you.
Butch, thank you so much. Really short, concise, and sweet. Thank you very much indeed. Some very good recommendations or proposals there. Our last speaker for this session this morning is probably one of the more important voices in the room. I'm really pleased that we can welcome Vicky Arnaiz-Lanting, who's basically representing somebody who's actually lived through and been subject to a disaster and to being on the receiving end of humanitarian assistance. Vicky's a member of the Leyte chapter of the Philippine Red Cross, and she's actually a journalist by profession. She's also a resident of Tacloban, and a survivor, of course, therefore, of Typhoon Haiyan, which shook the Philippines last November. And she's going to share some of her perspectives with us. Vicky's told me she's a little nervous, so please be nice to her. Vicky, over to you.
Thank you, Oliver. Fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. 9 months after Haiyan decimated the central Philippines last November 8, 2013, the surge of support and humanitarian action was overwhelming, but still wanting. The magnitude of destructions and lives lost brought by Haiyan was something the humanitarian community has paused to reconsider how humanitarian action can be efficient and effective in responding to the affected communities. 4 days we were cut from the rest of the world. No internet, no radio, no telephone and cell phones working. No water and food for several days. No electricity for several months. Can you imagine what would it feel like if you were in our shoes? Tacloban City, Philippines, where I came from, was the ground zero of Haiyan. It was like a war zone without cannons and bombs. It was like a ghost town with dead bodies everywhere, and people walking like zombies, not knowing where to head to. 10 ships were awash inland. Nonetheless, allow me to present the key results of the stakeholders' consultation representing affected community here in the PowerPoint. The respondents said local actors should play a central role in the humanitarian system. Communities believed that their own efforts are the most effective, followed by assistance from the local government and the local national civil society organizations. People in the community helping each other were a sight after Haiyan. Volunteerism was at its best. When security and people's safety were at risk because of looting, jailbreaks, and other elements, it was the local actors who provided security in the area before outside response arrived. Trust the local actors. Trust the local actors. The governments, of course, only those with political will, and the CSOs, they know the culture of the place, they know the terrain. Just make sure the CSOs are not politicized. Equip them with life-saving skills, equipments, and provide them with funding. Investing in them will save a lot of funding in the long run because the community is more or less ready when disaster strikes. We just have to make sure would uphold the values of neutrality, independence, impartiality, among others, and promote human dignity. Media can help. Equitable, objective, and fast reporting to build up morale and to strengthen the volunteer movement and to have a more efficient response must be encouraged. In no other time that media's role was more defined than the aftermath of Haiyan. The social media and the mainstream media. The social media act like journalists in reporting what happened on the ground, who were missing, what were needed there. It linked families. The social media was their platform, even raising funds for the affected community. The mainstream media's reporting for equitable, objective, and fast built up morale, encouraged more volunteers across the globe. The journalists text their stories to the editors because their laptops were destroyed. Always thought of what happened to the members of the media in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. This is one sector in the community, the people and funding donors forgot to immediately help. Next, we have the humanitarian services should be more coordinated rather than secondary disaster effects to us. The Philippines is routinely called the most disaster-restricted country in the world, with nearly 20 storms and increasing in its intensity each year. To have better shelter that is disaster resilience were the cries of Haiyan survivors. On the third or the fourth month, recovery should have taken place with the construction of shelter, and shelter repair kits assistance should have been given already. The humanitarian service became a second disaster issue because the response was not swift enough, for the survivors are still living in tents, bunkhouses, and 5 storms had already slammed our area after Haiyan. Using substandard materials in the bunkhouses in close proximity to each other is a fire hazard was a disaster response. This one is another case. The supposed construction of 500 transitional shelters could have been constructed by one of the foreign donors. It would have been row houses with area of 5 square meters. And you know, it's really small for a regular family of 5, Filipino family of 5. It could have been disaster if it was pushed through. But because of the intervention of Philippine Red Cross Chairman Richard Gordon, instead of shelter being constructed, Chairman Gordon suggested classrooms be built across Haiyan-affected areas in time for the January school opening. The 166 transitional classrooms were built in a record of 30 days. That's how assessment on the ground is very important. That's how coordinating with the locals and the CSOs is very important. I would say disaster preparedness should be a way of life. Listening to the voices of the most vulnerable in the affected community will assure faster and efficient response. The world is one community after all. Let us focus the strengthening capacity of the community to be safe and resilient. Better linkages with the local players and host government units. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of you here and the world for the tsunami and surge of support you have extended to the people of the Philippines after Haiyan. Maraming salamat, mabuhay.
Vicky, thank you very much. A real dose of realism there, I think, from you. So thank you very much indeed for that. Now, due to the wonders of modern technology, we're going to ask our panelists to move their chairs to the middle of the stage. I think somebody is going to switch off the projector if I'm lucky. Someone's going to switch off the projector if I'm lucky. Has someone pushed the button on the projector? It's coming? Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. And the lights come up. It's all working perfectly. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for moving over. The floor is now open for questions from the floor here. We also have this session being webcast live, so there are probably questions coming in from outside this hall, and I want to make sure that we capture some of those. So if we don't get to everybody in the room, I apologize, but I think we also need to reflect on what people outside the room are saying. But I see Victor's hand going straight up, so if we can give the microphone to Victor, and if somebody can let me have any questions that are coming in from the web, that would be great. Victor, over to you.
Again, Victor Rembet from Disaster Resource Partnership, Indonesia, members of the World Economic Forum. One thing that I would like to comment from the survey is that private sectors is the least exposed in this initiative, because looking at the charts and everything, very, very little or even no private sectors is exposed in that kind of thing. Therefore, I think I hear clearly here that the issue of coordinations regarding not just unleashing the private sectors, but also integrating the private sectors in the coordination mechanism. And that's actually my questions to whether, I think it's a must. This is a time to reform the Interagency Standing Committee, because globally, we're talking about the clusters. We need a wider horizons that could include private sectors, because private sectors, we are not talking not just about results-oriented, but also resource-oriented. We have some resources that can be put integrative in the all clusters. Say, for example, we're talking about from protections, communication, even to the early recovery. So this is something that we need to discuss that whether it's possible, but for me, it's now the time to reform the Interagency Standing Committee to become wider. And also to the regional organization, I do think so that private sectors is the actors. We are not just a quasi-humanitarian actors. We are active humanitarian actors that could be put in the regional organization, because most of the time we're talking about the MNC and multinational companies and transnational companies that could go beyond boundaries, beyond geopolitical boundaries. And that's where also this is something that I'm also requesting or also posing to the ASEAN, that for example, we need some more coordinations with the ASEAN in how to do a cross-boundary hazard that we could do together. And then, of course, ASEAN has the role, the leadership role, and then including all the MNC and TNC in this area. And then in the national level, I'm sure that up till now in the humanitarian counter teams, very little integrations with the private sectors. And this is something that it's only about CSO. I mean, I heard the lady from Korea, but well, in most of the countries, we are talking that no private sectors is included in the humanitarian country stream, and this is something that we would like to see this happening. I mean, the reformations of all this coordination mechanism that could also integrating the private sectors, and I hear clearly from the affected communities that's actually what we would like to see. Now it's not about the big companies, it's not the multinational companies that could be involved in any affected communities' problems, but we're talking about how to make this happening even in the SMEs, the small, medium enterprise, that they are the local players. They could work together with the MNCs, the big companies. And therefore, I think, this is my comment, I would like to see this happening in this 2 days consultation. Thank you.
All right, Victor, thank you very much. A number of very clear statements, I think, from you of what you'd like to see coming out of the consultation, but a couple of questions. I think one to your question about the Interagency Standing Committee, which maybe I'll try and answer in a minute. But first of all, maybe Butch would like to respond on the national level issues, and Ms. Bala on the relationship with ASEAN. One microphone, please.
Yes, I agree with those comments. That's why I think it's important that if we can come out with Thanks, Oliver. I agree with those comments, but I think that's why I think it's important if we can have a formal pre-agreement, as they have here in Japan, among the different actors, including some of the military, if we can, and the private sector and the international agencies, in which we agree to at least coordinate our efforts during a future disaster. If we can come out of this in the next 2 days to at least agreeing to begin the process, or coming out with even an initial draft, even with some general wording, I think that'll be a big help. And as my colleague said, I think there are some areas, especially in terms of logistics, firms, aircraft, shipping, and manufacturers, that will help in terms of not just relief, but in terms of economic recovery. And that'll help enhance humanitarian effectiveness as a whole. Though I have to say that it's not the answer to everything, but I think it will help.
Thank you. Alicia.
Okay, thank you for the question and comments. One, I just wanted to share with you that the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management is working on how to really engage the private sector more in the disaster initiatives of the region. And we are expanding this because we started first with the partnership group. We call it the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, where we have all international organizations and key regional organizations that form as part of our network. And secondly, just to concretize how ASEAN is now engaging the private sector, we are embarking on what we call a modeling project that ASEAN will support one of its member states when a disaster strikes, not only during the disaster phase, meaning the relief efforts, but even in a more sustained recovery. And we're bringing in the private sectors to help us come up with that model through the participation in our rebuilding technical workshops, so that we can engage them with the participants coming from the local and affected communities in the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan. And with this as a model, we can use that, and it will be flexible and adaptable to the context of the member states of ASEAN.
Thank you very much for the comments on the need for the interaction between interagency coordination, standing coordination, and the private sector. I'm not quite sure if there's a very systematic way of collaboration between the private sector and interagency standing committee as such, but I have seen many concrete examples of private company working with international NGOs. In our case, many of the relatively big companies have been assisting Tohoku region after the tsunami through collaboration with international as well as national NGO in the country. I think some companies are coming out of corporate social responsibility aspect, because this is the time that everyone's need is sought after. So therefore, company making sure that in meeting with their corporate social responsibility, they would come in to help. At the same time, the employees of the private company, this one including not so big company, but the smaller, small and medium enterprises here in Japan, they are very active that they volunteer work in the field in Tohoku. Often the employees are led by company's president, going to Tohoku area, staying for a couple of days, painting the school building, repairing the park so that children can have opportunity to play around and so on. So I think we have seen a concrete example of collaboration between some of the NGO and the private sector. But I think it is very important to come up with more systematic way of achieving collaboration between private sector and the big guys in the interagency standing committee. So I agree with you, and this is the opportunity, since we are all here, we should be able to discuss further in coming up with concrete way forward. Thank you.
Kunio, thank you very much indeed. We have some questions coming in from the web, which I'm going to turn to next, and then I will come back to the room afterwards. A question, maybe I think I can ask this one to Vicky, because you raised the importance of really listening from the beginning. What is the best way to share early needs assessment information when electric communications are down? So in that first 3 or 4 days, when you have volunteers on the ground who are going out and identifying what the needs are, how do we get that information out to the people who are bringing in the assistance so that it's done appropriately? And you may not have an answer, but I thought maybe it would be good to ask you that question.
Some of our colleagues went to the nearest municipality where there was available electricity and telephone connection. There, they were able to contact relatives.
All right, thank you very much. Second question coming in from outside the room is to Butch, and it's a very specific question. What do you propose to be the content of the pre-agreement between the military and the private sector, and how will you ensure the appropriateness of the approach?
Well, if we can put together a short statement signed by many of
the mic's not on.
If we can put together a short statement signed by many of the actors in this room and include other, for example, some of the larger companies in the region, if we can put together some kind of agreement just saying that we agree in the event of a future disaster, we will coordinate and cooperate our efforts. And something to that extent, between the UN, some of the national players, NGOs, and maybe some private companies and private associations. I think that'll be a start, but it'll be a very concrete model that can be used in other places, and we can keep adding to it as we go along. But we have 2 days to come up with a formal agreement. It doesn't necessarily have to tie us to specifics, because I know that can be difficult, but if it just ties us to the idea of coordinating together, then I think that's progress.
Great, Butch, thank you very much. Okay, back into the room. I see the gentleman on the third table back. 1, 2, 3. Yes, you, sir. But let's if we can, let's take 2 or 3 questions, because there's a little group over there who want to ask questions. So this gentleman, I think Dan Tool, then, sorry, my eyesight's bad, colleague here on this table, and then Ms. Chen from this table here. So these 4 questions, and then we'll come back to the panel for some answers. Over to you, sir.
Hi, thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Ohashi. I represent JANIC, Japan's NGO network, largest Japanese NGO network for international cooperation. This morning, I'm hearing you, but I have a strong, curious feeling that why we talk mainly about conventional disasters, natural disasters and conflict. In Japan, March 11, we have Fukushima disaster, which is still going on. And as a CSO humanitarian workers, we face a lot of problems. because we are not at all prepared for this kind of disaster, because we didn't have a much limited knowledge, and the government information was not always reliable or changing, and the standard of the upper limit of radiation is also quite controversial. So we need a lot, and still the compensation is there, but it is creating more division among community and within the family. So there are many, many complicated problems which must be recorded and shared internationally, so that, you know, most dense area in terms of nuclear reactors and population is Asia. So next, which I don't want to expect, but next disaster, nuclear disaster, might take place in Asia. So we have to prepare for those things. So so far, very few people discuss this point. Maybe we have to change our mindset to prepare for our future to prevent. We cannot prevent it. I mean, the prevention is a more technical side, but for the humanitarian actors, we have to prepare for that. Okay. How do you think, especially for the ASEAN representative or CSO or colleagues? I just want to ask this question.
Okay, thank you. Any particular member of the panel you'd like to address that question to? Because it's got to be to one member of the panel. We're short on time. Sorry? ASEAN, okay, addressed to Ms. Bala from ASEAN. I think Dan Toole next. If you can introduce yourself, please, Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Toole. I'm the Regional Director for UNICEF in Asia Pacific. I guess I'm going to reflect on Valerie's comment this morning that we be bold, and it's less a question than a suggestion. I'm hearing that we want to, from the private sector, from CSOs, expand the conversation, get more seats at the table for the IESC, the Interagency Standing Committee. And I really wonder, are we asking the wrong question? Do we need a different table? Do we need a different conversation rather than just expanding the existing one? I sat in the IESC for 4 years. It's an interesting conversation, but it doesn't determine what happens at national and local level. And what I hear from you, we need a different approach at national and local level that emphasizes national and local capacity. So is there a way instead to say every country should have an NDMA or NDMO, National Disaster Management Authority, organization, et cetera, that is empowered to pull in civil society, that ensures that private sector capacity is involved, that we all together strengthen that? The Interagency Standing Committee at global level looks at global policy, global interagency. Frankly, it's not going to help you in Tacloban. I was also there. It's too remote. What we need is local capacity, national capacity. So let's build that rather than trying to get more chairs at an existing table. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Very useful input. Yes, please.
Yep, I'm Haider Yaqub. I work for Plan International at their regional office. My question is, whenever disasters come to our mind, there are two players who are most important. One is media, the next is military. I do not see enough of media's engagement. And when I say that, I don't want them to be covering this story, but to be educated in disaster. And the other is, we talk about effectiveness. We still have to define effectiveness, what it is. And I think that's where the role of academicians need to be brought in, academics, so that we can define it more effectively, so that it makes sense to the communities, to the grassroots civil society organizations, so that they all understand what is being talked about and what is being expected of. Thank you.
Okay, and lastly, Hong Chen.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'm here not to raise a question, but...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
What?
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Chen Hong from China Earthquake Administration. I used to be former Deputy Director of Earthquake Emergency Response Department of China Earthquake Administration. And I also as a classifiers and also involved in a lot of INSARIG. So I'm here maybe to not raise a question, but try to share some experience in China. You see, China is a disaster-prone country that may be prone to various kind of disasters. And in China, we have a very, it's a more effective systems, mechanisms to control, manage with the disaster management. And the major principle of China is to unify the command by the government, central government, and clearly division of the work and the level by level management, with local authorities playing the main role and under the support of the communities. And also, this is not only played in the disaster response, emergency response, also played very well in the disaster preparedness. So I think that's maybe we can consider of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I'm going to hand back to our panelists. Maybe I can ask Ms. Bala to go first on the question of, I guess, I don't know how to describe this, unusual, unexpected disasters and cooperation around that. Kunio, are you happy to take the IASC question? And the question of effectiveness and what it is, I don't know who would like to handle that one. Maybe we can give that one to Faye, if you'd like to respond to that one. So Alicia, maybe you can go first.
Thank you. The question about non-conventional disasters brought about technology, I would say it's technology when you talk about nuclear plants and the like. Let me put it this way. I mean, first, ASEAN as a region right now has a policy on nuclear-free zone, and this is being advocated across, and also with our dialogue partners and those who are interested. Secondly, this is something that we still need to talk about. I mean, candidly, this is something that we have to address and to be forward-looking, because there are some maybe member states who would already be looking at nuclear power plants as a source or alternative source of energies, but not necessarily for, for purposes of a nuclear weapon. So I think these are the initiatives that are being undertaken, and we will take this into consideration, and we will bring it also not only in the area of the Disaster Management Committee, but also with our counterparts from the political as well as the economic pillars also. Thank you. So that's as far as I can talk about, because so far it has not been part of our discussions about non-conventional. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Kunio.
Coming from the IASC constituency, I thought that I should be most bold. So I made a couple of very critical comments on how IASC should operate. In that context, I have noted that there's disconnect between big guys and the local CSOs, unfortunately. And I can feel it, because I used to be with the so-called mainstreamed development partner group, coming from Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and other bilateral agencies, where I didn't see any representative from the local CSO, including the needs assessment exercise. Now that I am with the NGO, and I feel quite frustrated, because whatever we see from the ground, based on our experience in the field, are not reaching out to big guys. And I used to attend development partner meeting where we can have regular policy dialogue with the governments. But I, again, don't see our role in those coming from NGOs. So I strongly feel that this disconnect between big guys and local CSO be addressed. And here, I think big guy should fully recognize that the local CSO and the community members themselves should be able to undertake lots of activity beneficial for the vulnerable people on the ground. So we should allocate activity and the funds to be spent by local CSO in conducting their field level activity. On the effectiveness, somebody asked for definition of it. My definition is essentially for longer term impact and results. And I don't want to see humanitarian response in isolation with the rest of the development cycle, as I mentioned. I consider that humanitarian response at the emergency situation, then the recovery, reconstruction, development, having this disaster management aspect should be very much part of the integral part of the cycle. And this is where each actor should recognize its own role and the responsibility. And after realizing different partners working in the cycle, then we should be able to better coordinate for larger impact and the development goals. That's all from me at this moment. Thank you.
Faye, do you want to add something to that? Which could you?
Okay, thank you for the comments and the questions. And then I just briefly share from some of the questions my own opinions. The first one I want to talk with, I want to comment is the WHS, non-conventional disasters. I really agree with you. Korea is also very much in that sense, like nuclear plants. We are building a lot of nuclear plants, and then Asia is most dense region. So in that sense, the preparedness is really important. And then from that sense, CSOs have huge, although CSOs are normally considered very weak in terms of the capacity and resources, but then we have people. People are the power. So a very important role of CSO is to advocate. So that is the one major strength that CSOs can take from our voices to be heard at our national level of government. So there will be nice if we CSOs in Asian region to have collected voices over the national policies regarding all those risky situation of this non-conventional disasters in the face of the disaster preparedness. And one other impression I got from some of the questions and all those panel discussions is that at national level, national actors are really important, and they are the main they are the main actor actually. So national actors, we say governments and the military, private sector, and CSOs are all including in the national actors. So in national disasters, in many cases, it's not more like coordination, it's more command and control. That's how the national disasters are, done. So one of the ways that we can actually improve the national disaster authority can improve their coordination skill, recognizing diverse actors within the nation, within the country. I mean, when you talk at this kind of UN or international discussions, then CSOs and then importance of the private sectors is all recognized at some point. But when you go back to your own country, CSOs and all these other actors are not that level of participation in their own country. So it will be so national and local level of authority they have to strengthen their own efforts to recognize diverse actors within the nation, within the country. So that can be separated from like national level of efforts and then international level of efforts. And then it doesn't mean that we need to take more seat in the IAEA sure thing. If that's happening, it's that inclusive partnership and dialogue happening in the nation, then it's naturally also go up to the international level, I think.
Great, okay, thank you. We need to break for lunch. I'm going to ask one final question which came in from the internet. Sounds odd, but came in from the web, from people who are outside the room. And basically, it can be a one-sentence answer, please, from each of you. What do you hope is going to come out of this meeting that we can take forward to the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016? One sentence, please, because we're very short on time. Let me start off with Cunyo, if I can, please.
At the end of the meeting tomorrow, I'd like to see concrete, or I would say, some of concrete measures, action to be agreed upon in moving forward, taking fullest extent of partnership of the different actors involved. Too broad, but.
One key cross-sectoral issue that we can work on among ourselves.
Very good, nice and concise. Butch.
Just an agreement saying that we, the undersigned representatives of our respective organizations, do hereby declare on July 24, 2014 in Tokyo, our intention to cooperate and coordinate our efforts in the event of a major disaster in Asia. We recognize the importance of the various groups in these disasters and the primacy of local actors in the process. Something along those lines.
I can only guess you wrote that down before you came into the room, because
No,
that
I
was
did
long.
that, here.
Vicky.
A global commitment of making disaster preparedness a way of life.
Great, thank you.
I have.
Faye.
Global light country-focused strategy that will enhance inclusive partnership.
Great, thank you all very much indeed. I think a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. Right.